Hi, I'm bobbaulch, and I am going to tell you about jury duty today. I am juror number 8. I'm also the foreman of the jury in the trial here in Jefferson County, Texas, regarding Michael Lawrence Pousson and his alleged continual sexual assault of a little girl between her ages of 5 and 7 in the counties of Orange County, Texas, and Jefferson County, Texas.
A jury is still deliberating the fate of a man accused of sexually abusing a child. Michael Pousson is charged with continuous sexual abuse of a child, which is a first-degree felony.
So today was our first full day of jury deliberations. We had a partial day before or on Friday last week. Today's Monday, and this was our first full day devoted to nothing but jury deliberations. And I'm not publishing this yet because we haven't come to a unanimous decision yet in the jury room. We started off with a quick vote real quick just to make sure that we were still 8 for guilty and 4 for not guilty. Then we started going through the reasons why people thought that the defendant was guilty, and then reasons why people thought that he was not guilty. It all came down to, do you believe the little girl or do you believe the man? And so some people gave some reasons why they did all that. I'm going to kind of concentrate on what I said. I'm leaning towards guilty, honestly, and the reason for that is just the details of the complainant's testimony, the details of it. And it makes perfect sense in my mind as to there being a lot of detail the first time something new happened, and then all the repetitive times after that just kind of being blurred together and you just don't remember the details. So for instance, the very first thing that she talked about was being raped outside while hunting with the defendant, and she talks about her knees in the mud, the grass and the mud, and him putting down like a towel or a rug underneath her to keep her from getting too dirty. Her being bent over a lawn chair, and she talked about the color of the lawn chair. She talked about where her hands were holding on to the lawn chair. She talked about the defendant telling her what to do with her clothes and where her clothes were, whether they were partially on her body or not. And she talked about what the defendant was doing behind her, that she could tell what he was doing with his hands as well. And him telling her to not wiggle and getting angry at her for wiggling so much and that it hurt, and that it was cold outside, and all those details for that one incident. And then she really couldn't, remember very much of other instances that might have happened while they were hunting together. And then she talked about in detail what happened in a pickup truck and the people walking by and the defendant pulling up his pants and looking in the back of the truck and how her position was in the front seat or the defendant standing at the door. And just all of those details about how that felt and how she had to climb over and it was just so many details. And then when asked, about other times in the truck, it was, well, I can't remember. Just it all blurred together. And then the details of what happened in the bathroom and the KY jelly and where that was found and what he told her to do when he was finished and all those things, just so many little details that a little girl, I didn't think, would be able to just make up those details, telling a story. That these would be details in a professional author's novel, those types of details. She remembers all the details when something is in a brand new place, and then as it happens again, she just remembers one detail. It hurt. And so I thought that lent credibility to her testimony. But we talked about whether you can coach a young child to remember all those things. And if you're thinking that she was coached, why do you think she was coached? And so we also had we got all of the evidence, all of the physical evidence and the reports and things like that were turned in. And in those evidence reports, the reason why we asked for those evidence reports is because some of the jurors said that they didn't believe that the little girl, the complainant, was consistent in her testimony. And so when we said, well, let's find out if she's consistent. I mean, it's been 2 years since this happened to her. She had an exam. She was interviewed by the nurse here in Jefferson County. Let's go on ahead and look at what she said to the nurse. And so we got that information. We read it out loud, and it was very consistent with what she said on the witness stand. Very consistent. Her story had not changed. But as foreman as the jury, I was reading it, and I noticed I made a note about some of the things that were in that report that I thought were interesting. And the thing that I thought was interesting was that the defendant showed her pornography on his phone and his computer, and it was his phone, not hers, because there was testimony that he had put blocks on the kids' phones so that they couldn't view inappropriate things. And she said in her sexual assault nurse exam that the defendant showed her weird pictures, weird things of boys putting their private parts in girls' private parts. And so the word weird, she was not accustomed to it when she talked to the nurse in 2021 when she was only 7 years old. It was weird. It's not like she had been exposed to pornography 24/7 and was used to looking at those things. She thought those things were weird. They didn't make sense to her. So I thought that was interesting in her testimony, and I didn't bring that up as lots of people were talking. But the other thing was she said that the defendant presented his sexual organ to her, told her to play with it. That was an interesting thing. It doesn't really matter how much pornography you watch, unless you're dealing with probably an illegal type of pornography. You're not going to see many grown men in pornography say, play with it. And yet that's what he told her to do, was play with it. That's something that you say to someone who's not familiar with looking at a male's sexual organ. Specifically, a child, you would just tell a child to play with it. You're wanting them to touch it, right? And then the other thing from the nurse examination that I thought was interesting was she said that it happened in his room, in the defendant's room, when she was talking about what happened in Orange County. She was very specific. His room, not mom's room, not mom and dad's room, not their room, but it was his room. He was in control of that room. It was his house. They moved into his house. It was his room. But when she talked about things that happened in Jefferson County, Texas, she said it was in my room. She had possession of a room. It was her room. And so that the ability to switch between Orange County and his room, Jefferson County and my room in one sentence shows that that's a detail that would be very difficult to drill into somebody's head who's only 7 years old, talking to a nurse having not had the time to get prepped, because as soon as mom found out, she took off and she didn't talk to her daughter until afterwards, right? She dropped her daughter off at the corner store. She had, when she came back from the corner store, the police were talking to her, and I mean, she said she didn't want her daughter to see her upset. So all of those details, I think, were a big boon for the legitimacy of the complainant's testimony. So we'll talk just a little bit about the other side, the people who say that the defendant is not guilty. Why would they say that? And so a couple of the things that they said, the reasons why they believe he's not guilty, are like this. I wrote them down. So one of them said that the little girl's testimony had changed on what she called the body parts. And during that, but my response to that is, during the testimony, she kept on having generic terms, and the prosecutor had to nail down specifically what the body parts were. So when you say your back private parts, what do you mean? And finally I had to narrow it down. Well, that's where I poop. So, and the front body parts, that's where I do whatever. So that was the thing about that. They also said that if the defendant was grooming the little girl, why did he leave so many times? And so that's a good question. If you're grooming someone that you're going to rape repeatedly, why leave and relinquish control of her and take the chance of her saying something to somebody? Well, that's what happened, right? When he was out of the picture for a while, she did tell somebody, and he was coming back on a regular basis. So one of the ladies, so the jurors who think that he's not guilty, they're women. And I'm not saying anything like, it's because they're women or anything, but I'm going to call them ladies and her and things like that. So one of the ladies talked about, well, when the defendant why didn't he take his boys hunting? Why did he only take this little girl hunting? And we don't know who he took hunting, but she pointed out, that's not really hunting because it's just in the backyard and there's no trees and there's a fence, and that's a good point. And yet during his testimony, he said that, yeah, we would go hunting in one way, just kind of to get rid of nuisance animals. A couple of other things that they said were, mom could coach her on the entire story, and that it's all just made up, and they really didn't have anything to back that up with, but that's just how they were feeling. So one of the ladies, and they're all nice ladies, and I believe that they're being very forthright and honest, and that there's no ulterior motive. It's just we're not all on the same page. One of them said that she, in her mind's eye, saw that after the 2018 accusation in Orange County, that mom was constantly asking, that grandma was constantly asking, and that they were just turning this girl into a kind of a hypersexualized little kid. And then one of the ladies said that if a man puts his sexual organ in a little girl, it's going to hurt, and she would walk funny, and that you can tell when a little girl is no longer a virgin, and none of the medical reports said that she was no longer a virgin. We did point out that both of those, that we have medical experts that say that neither one of those is true. One of them said that the little girl and her cousin spent a lot of time together, and that when the cousin saw that the complainant was getting all of the attention from everyone, that she came up with a story so she could get some attention too. She said that when we got down to it, we finally said, let's make a list of the things from the case, the actual evidence from the case that lends credibility to the defendant being guilty, and then let's make a list of evidence that says, this really points to the defendant being not guilty. And so here's the things that we talked about that tend to show that the defendant is guilty. That the DNA evidence shows that he's 140 times more likely to be the owner of the DNA inside the little girl's panties than anybody else. And that, I don't think we wrote this down, but the DNA also proved that his son was not a donor, and half the son's DNA is from the dad. So that's, I think that the DNA is strong enough to exclude someone with half of the dad's DNA. That the little girl positively ID'd the man in the court, said that's the man that raped me. Another thing was that the defendant had filed for bankruptcy, lost his house, and moved in with the mom and the little girl. All he brought was his clothes because everything in the house had been sold and it was being auctioned off. Yet the little girl, the complainant, said she was taken to that empty house. After she was living in Jefferson County, the defendant took her to that empty house and raped her there. And so that is, how in the world would she know that the house was empty? I don't think little girls know about auctioning off all the, getting rid of everything in the house so it can be auctioned off. She also had so many details about the storage unit, so many details about the woods. She knew specific sexual positions that would lend themselves to a grown man raping a young child. She talked about knowing where the KY jelly was, talked about knowing what ejaculation looked like, watching videos that the defendant showed her, and it was very clinical when she talked about the sexual assault. Very clear, wasn't, you could tell she was not making up stuff as she went along. She knew what she wanted to say. She talked about vaginal, anal, and oral penetration or rape. We talked about the little cousin. Her testimony shows a propensity for the defendant to molest little girls. The complainant said that he tricked her into going to areas, and little kids, 5, 6, 7 years old, are gullible and can be tricked into doing things, that he bribed her to cooperate, that he was always asking for the little girl to come with him when he went and did errands and everything, that the outcry happened in August of 2021, and 2 months later, the defendant was in Las Vegas for between 1 and 2 months, and that the defendant, when he was on the stand, didn't show any emotion. He focused on what the prosecuting attorney said and what the defense attorney said, and he didn't look at the jury at all. All of the other people on the stand, if they were asked a question, what's the next letter after C, they would look at the jury and say, it's D. They would, they're trying to convince the jury, and it seemed like he was trying to convince the attorneys and not the jury. And then the other ones were that the mom had noted that there was KY on his sexual organ and that there would be no reason for KY on a sexual organ. And that the cameras did not capture anything. We thought that that was actually kind of evidence that was for the complainant, because the cameras didn't capture everything. He knew it was his house. He knew where the cameras were. And when he was in Jefferson County, the testimony was that it happened in her bedroom and the bathroom, and there aren't cameras in there. So here's the evidence that the three ladies came up with as to why he's not guilty. The DNA is only 140 times more likely for him to have committed it. That we don't know the source of where his DNA came from, how it got on the panties. That the mom chased down the defendant. That the mom still loved the defendant. That the son, the defendant's son, was accused and that case was closed for a while. That it totally relies on testimony. That the defendant was always working. That mom was not credible. That the cousin could not positively ID the defendant in court. That the little girl said, "I don't remember too many times." That the little girl didn't show enough emotion on the stand, or any emotion on the stand, and that the little girl was twisting in her chair while she was talking. And so that's the evidence why he's not guilty. So what are we going to do? Tomorrow we're going to have another day of deliberations. I'm going to bring up a couple of things about the timeline that I think are interesting, and hopefully will show that the defendant did it. You know, I want us to all review the timeline together. Maybe someone will come up with something that shows the timeline is so out of sync that it can't make sense that the defendant is innocent, and then I'll have to change my thoughts on it, and I'm perfectly willing to do that, and I want to be able to do that if he is indeed not guilty. I don't want an innocent person to go to prison. So there you go. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Everything that happened today is in the past. Oh, we did have one other vote. One of the we started off 8-4, and then by the end of the day we were at 9-3. A gentleman changed his vote. He said, I thought for sure that he was not guilty. And then he said he had to think of it reasonably and take out the scenarios made up in his head as to why the defendant could be innocent, and just go based on what the evidence is. And then he said he really didn't have any choice. He had to change his mind. That, and the defendant ran after being accused. So there you go. Short video today, but we'll knock it off tomorrow and see when we get to the courtroom if anyone has changed their mind after thinking about it. Again, this is the That's Jesus channel, so been doing a lot of praying about this, and just asking God for wisdom and discernment and calm and peace and patience and long suffering and all those good beatitudes that because these are people's opinions. They are going to impact someone's life. So there's really only 4 scenarios, right? The defendant is guilty, and we find him guilty, and he goes to prison. That's one of the scenarios. The other one is the defendant is guilty, and we find him not guilty. That's we certainly don't want that, because the parties that were victims in this will. That's horrible for them. The other scenario is the defendant is not guilty, and that's what we find him not guilty. And if the complainant and all of the witnesses lied, or they just had bad memories, or we're coached or the power of suggestion, whatever. If the defendant's not guilty and we find him not guilty, then they're just going to have to live with that. But if the defendant is not guilty and we find him guilty, the fourth scenario, that would be horrible, to send an innocent man to prison probably for the rest of his life. And so we don't want that to happen. So, four scenarios, and really only two of them are good, right? If he's guilty, we find him guilty. And if he's not guilty, we find him not guilty. Those are the only two outcomes that I want. One of those. And so I'm just asking God for discernment and wisdom, lots of wisdom, for me and for everybody else on the jury as well. Whew. Boy, it's been a long day. So I hope you have a great day. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. If you haven't seen the rest of the videos in this series, be sure and look in the description to find those other video links. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, you want to find out about some Bible teachings, some Bible history, some, just things to do with Jesus. That's what the other videos on my channel are about. So I hope you have a great day. Be blessed.